Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and you've found your way to Kinda Murdery, a place that means more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories, the unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. Hello everybody, welcome to Kinda Murdery. I'm your host, Zevin Odelberg. You know, sometimes people think that our predilection for and the media's predilection for hyperbole is a modern thing fueled by social media and the internet and the 24-hour news cycle, etc. But the truth is, Americans have nearly always had a love affair with hyperbole, with exaggeration. In fact, there are 3 different trials that the media dubbed the trial of the century, and that are often referred to by legal scholars as the trial of the century. What's a little bit funny, as it relates to our love affair with exaggeration, is that all 3 of these trials took place within a decade of each other. 2 of them within a year of each other. Perhaps they should have been competing for trial of the decade, but indeed the stakes were high and the participants famous. The 3 trials I'm referring to, of course, 1924's Leopold and Loeb case, 1925's John Scopes monkey trial, and 1934's Lindbergh baby trial. For a triplet of trials of the century that all happened within a decade of each other, these cases are all very different. 2 of them, however, have one key thing in common. Famous, or perhaps, depending on who you ask, infamous, defense attorney Clarence Darrow would defend the accused in both the Leopold and Loeb case and the John Scopes monkey trial. The crimes themselves were wildly unalike, however. Leopold and Loeb were accused of horrific child murder with a chisel, no less. John Scopes of teaching evolutionary science to his students. If you're wondering which trial we're going to cover today, this is kinda murdery, so it will not be the John Scopes evolution trial. We are, in fact, going to wade into what some still consider to be the most notorious crime in American history. Put your personal items underneath the seat in front of you. Stow your baggage in the overhead compartment. Buckle your seatbelt and let go of the worries of the day. But be warned, there's turbulence expected ahead. I bring you part 1 of the Chicago horror, Leopold and Loeb. Kinda Murdery starts now. It was a pleasant, sunny spring afternoon in Chicago on May 21st, 1924, and 14-year-old Robert Franks was on his way home from school. He made the kind of progress that all boys in that era would make on a day like this. There were steam shovels to inspect, baseball games to be umpired, new bikes to be tried out. If he didn't return home right away, well, so what? That was to be expected, and certainly no cause for alarm. His parents had learned to accept with patience his boyish refusals to return home on time. If Robert's parents were worried at all, it was only that he make it home in time for dinner, and in this duty, Robert rarely, if ever, failed. The Franks were a wealthy family who lived in a large mansion and employed a live-in serving staff. At a little after 6 o'clock that evening, Mr. Franks sent 2 of the house servants in search of his prodigal son. During their absence, father and mother sat down to supper and with a few quiet words agreed upon the plan of further impressing upon their youthful wanderer the importance of being prompt and responsible. By 7 o'clock, their anxiety had developed into profound worry. Mrs. Franks begged her husband to inquire into the reasons for Robert's prolonged absence. She worried that something might have happened to him, but Mr. Franks was inclined to regard it lightly. He sought to dispel her doubts with the suggestion that Robert might have gone to a playmate's house and been persuaded to remain there for supper. "But I'm sure he would call me," persisted the mother. Mr. Franks put on his coat and hat and strode out the door of his massive home in search of the heir to his millions. While Mr. Franks was out, the servants returned. They were empty-handed. Robert had left the Harvard School, a private boys' institution located 4 blocks away, at the regular hour of dismissal. This they'd gleaned from the boys and groups of girls still playing in the neighboring streets. Despite inquiring from door to door, they found out nothing further. Robert, by all appearances, had simply and completely disappeared. The lines on Mrs. Frank's face deepened. She began to pace the floor. For one whom riches dispelled all domestic details and difficulties, Mrs. Frank suddenly became conscious of them. Previously, the telephone had been, well, perhaps just a means of communication, a convenient household equipment, and more often, a necessary nuisance. She looked at it hungrily. Would it bring news of Robert? Perhaps it was out of order. She picked it up, lifted the receiver, and heard the operator's reassuring soprano greeting. So the telephone was working, but why didn't somebody call? She studied the great oak door that led out into a spacious area that was more like a palace portico than a porch. Who would be the first to come through that door? Her son? Her husband? She gasped. Would it be an ambulance attendant? At the thought, Mrs. Frank swayed and fell to the floor in a dead faint. The servants rushed to her. Her limp form was carried to a sofa, and trembling hands worked over it. Down the block, Jacob Franks was ringing the bell at the door of Samuel Edelston, Corporation Counsel for the City of Chicago, and a warm friend of Frank's. They were confidants, and as soon as he was admitted to the house, Mr. Franks informed his friend of the undue absence of his son. "But Jacob," remonstrated Mr. Edelston, "it isn't yet 9 o'clock. I'm sure you're over-anxious about this. Come, chances are Robbie's decided to see a movie twice through." No. The father was sure he knew his son. Robert wouldn't do this. No, he's never absented himself without a word of explanation. Nothing like this. I'm worried. Put your hat on. We'll take a walk and look around. The two sauntered off. One of the pair occasionally halted a passing boy. "Have you seen my son Robert?" "No, mister, I ain't seen him. Is he lost?" They moved on, the friend consoling and the father unconsolable. "Have you seen Robert?" "No." The question began to burn. The voice quivered. The boys were blunt with their answers. It was nope or and just a shake of the head. Darkness was beginning to envelop the streets. Gradually, Mr. Edelston was forced to agree with Jacob Franks. The situation was serious. From that hour on, the situation for Mr. Franks was to be more than serious. It was to be a stark and haunting tragedy. A tragedy that no friend's smiles, comfort, or pity could soften. Tragedy that would slay him by torturous degrees. An hour more of tireless tramping around found Mr. Franks and his friend before the darkened windows of the Harvard School. A suspicion that perhaps Robert Franks might, under certain unexplainable circumstances, have been locked in the school building occurred to both men, and they tried various doors but with no avail. Not to be frustrated so easily, they decided upon an unconventional method of entry. Here is where the story does something that we call crossing the Rubicon. The disappearance of Robert Franks is no longer a private matter, a forgettable family incident. By virtue of the fact that a prominent millionaire and a senior public official climbed through the window of a school building at night, the case of missing boy Robert Franks became news. But not yet. For now we stay with the panicked father and his friend as they wearily search for the young boy. Eventually, they give up on the school. They had covered every room. They had shouted and called until the tremor of fear in their voices gave back such mournful echoes that they became silent and depressed. They departed from the building and made their way to Mr. Frank's home, hopeful though discouraged, apprehensive and yet totally unprepared for the shock that was to greet them. "Why are all the lights on?" said Mr. Franks as they mounted the steps. "I'll bet your long-lost son has returned to the fold," Mr. Edison ventured. But they were met with a state of affairs that nearly sent the father reeling. The occupants of the house were panic-stricken, and their hysterical explanations unintelligible. Mrs. Franks was dangerously ill. Stammering, the maid managed to share that there had been a telephone call. It had come while Mr. Franks was out. The atmosphere of the home was charged with excitement. "Who?" pleaded the frantic father, searching the eyes about him. Mr. Johnson?" the maid stuttered. "Robert has been kidnapped." Such was the beginning of the end. Life for the Franks family had been a sweet, happy existence before this day. Henceforth it was a process of dying, and dying broken-hearted. All the days of their lives were bound up in the bright, affectionate character of their son, Robert. Mr. Edelston took charge of affairs. When Mrs. Franks had recovered her composure sufficiently to speak, he questioned her concerning the phone call. When she lifted the receiver, a strange voice answered her by name and said, "This is Mr. Johnson speaking. As you probably understand, your son has been kidnapped. You can be sure no harm will come to him. Robert has been stolen for ransom. Tomorrow morning you will get complete instructions for the drop." The voice ceased abruptly, and Mrs. Franks went limp. Efforts were made to trace the call, but the connection had been broken long before telephone authorities could be advised. A doctor was summoned to the bedside of the boy's mother, and the father and Mr. Edelson began to talk it over. "I believe it's a prank," suggested Mr. Edelson consolingly. "I hope to God," murmured his friend. "I hope to God you're right, but I'm afraid not. Oh, I am afraid not." "The best thing we can do, I believe, is see the police," said Mr. Edelson. "I'd rather not," Mr. Franks objected. "I believe Robert is in a serious predicament. To employ the police might jeopardize his life. We'd better wait till morning for the letter." "Sam," murmured Robert's father in a startlingly different voice, Do you think Robert is dead?" The friend, a wonderful friend, met the question masterfully. "Come now, Jacob. Your nerves are running away with you. Listen, the police have every facility for tracing Bobby. Now's the time to put them to work. If we wait, we take unnecessary chances. If we strike back swiftly, everything will be in our favor. Here's your coat. Let's be off." Mr. Franks and Mr. Edelson drove directly to the Detective Bureau at 180 North LaSalle Street. It was a gloomy, dingy structure laden with the dust of the streets. 3 reporters inside were on duty, one from the City Press, another from the Chicago Tribune, and a third from the Chicago Herald-Examiner. Chief of Detective Michael Hughes, known to his friends and admirers as Go Get 'em Mike, was in his office. "Why, hello there, Sam," he greeted when he caught sight of Mr. Edelson. "What are you doing in a place like this at this time of night?" "Chief," retorted the visitor solemnly, "this is Mr. Franks, president of the Rockford Watch Company. You know him, of course. Something terrible's happened to, Mr. Franks. There's been a kidnapping and—" "What? Come in here. Step into my office. Jim Gortland! Oh, Gortland! Listen, Jim. Get rid of those reporters. This is serious business. I don't want any newspapers around. Take them out to lunch. Now come and be seated, gentlemen." "Say nothing of any of this to anyone," Mr. Franks began. "On the way down here, I gave my friend the impression that I would put this matter in the hands of the police, but I've been thinking it over, and I've decided otherwise. I'm willing to take your advice. I'm about ready to take anybody's advice, but this Mr. Johnson warned me of the consequences of going to the police." "Well, I can assure you," said the detective, "that the best detective talent in Chicago will help you out." "Well, yes, I appreciate that," answered Mr. Franks. "But I'm thinking of my son. Don't you see? I'm afraid of the risk." "Well, I believe he's right, Chief," interposed Edelson. "I believe the wisest thing we can do is go along with these men, these kidnappers. God, the word makes me shudder. Here's the deal, Chief. When Robert, Mr. Frank's son, failed to return home from school, his father called on me and we went hunting for him. Robert goes to the Harvard School, a private boys' school a few blocks from his home. Mr. Franks lives at 5052 Ellis Avenue. Well, we canvassed the neighborhood for the next 2 hours, but without any success. Finally, we went over to the school building and we crawled through an open window and searched the place from top to bottom, hoping that maybe Robert had fallen asleep after being locked in. There was no sign of him. Well, a little after 9 o'clock, Mr. Johnson calls Frank's home on the telephone and Mrs. Frank answers, and here's what he said." Edelson handed Chief Hughes a penciled transcript of the message that had caused Mrs. Franks to faint. "Are these the exact words?" "I'm reasonably certain they are," said Mr. Edelson. Mused Chief Hughes. "This is a very serious matter. Personally, I think we ought to assign the police to the case, whether it seems like proper procedure or not." For a quarter of an hour or more, the 3 debated the delicate problem, any decision about which seemed fraught with unspeakable dangers to the life and well-being of young Robert Franks. In the end, the father won out. His persistency in the belief that if the police interfered, his son would be murdered eventually broke down the arguments of the other 2. Something in the nature of a compromise was effected instead. Mr. Franks consented to have the police investigate in a sort of indirect way, but there were to be no attempts to get in direct contact with the kidnappers. It was midnight when Mr. Franks and Mr. Edelson headed back to Mr. Franks' home. They made ready for an all-night vigil beside the telephone. At the behest of the police, the telephone authorities supervised all calls coming into the Franks' home. While the mysterious Mr. Jacob had stated that he would furnish further instructions in the morning, he had neglected, or perhaps expressly omitted, to say just when he would supply that precious formula that would bring back Robert Franks. Hence it was an all-night vigil that the father and the friend kept. Through the black-pressing silence of the early morning hours, they kept vigil, talking softly for a time and then lapsing into seemingly endless intervals of complete quiet, during which periods, no doubt, the fondest hopes developed the hue of false illusion. Hey everybody, we're back. Thank you for taking a moment to support the brands that support Kinda Murdery. Phew, this is a heavy story. It's hard to tell. I can think of no greater horror than losing your child. but it's also one of the most famous cases in U.S. history and a pretty interesting study of a time period and of horrible criminal minds. I'd like to take a moment now to remind you, as I often do, of the free 3-digit number 988 that you can call to immediately receive counseling for substance use, mental health, or suicidal thoughts. Dial 988 and your call will immediately be answered by someone who cares. Please, program it into your phone and always remember that the world is a better place with you in it. And if you're not going through a crisis, but if you'd just like to make a connection with another human being or have somebody to talk to, please feel free to reach out to me, kindamurdery@gmail.com. Also, as a reminder, I have cerebral palsy, and I would love Kinda Murdery to be a support community for people with disabilities, physical or otherwise. And honestly, the goal of that is just that we all share our unique life experiences with other people so that perhaps the entire community gets to be exposed to ideas and thoughts and experiences that they hadn't considered before, because the more we can humanize each other, the more empathy we can achieve. So whether or not you're disabled, feel free again to reach out to me and share your story, and we can keep it between us, or I can share it on the show. That's up to you. Also, don't forget that I've got those cool full-color vinyl Kinda Murdery stickers, and please do leave reviews. It really helps. It doesn't just make me feel good, it makes the pod more visible so that other people can find it and our community can grow. But also, I'll be honest with you, it does make me feel good. I love to hear from you guys. I love to know that I'm not just speaking into a void. It's great to get the feedback. It makes all of this worthwhile. So please do leave reviews. Shoot me an email, kindamurdery@gmail.com. Connecting with people is really what storytelling is all about, and bringing us all together is what I hope to do with Kinda Murdery. And with that, let's get back to this terrible, horrible, no good, very bad story. Buckle up for the Chicago Horror, Leopold and Loeb, because Kinda Murdery resumes now. Through the black pressing silence of the early morning hours, they kept vigil, talking softly for a time and then lapsing into seemingly endless intervals of complete quiet, during which periods, no doubt, the fondest hopes developed the hue of false illusion. At 9 o'clock in the morning, there was a noise of swift feet on the stairs, and the doorbell was rung vehemently. Mr. Edelson was met by a mailboy bearing a special delivery letter addressed to Mr. Franks. It was torn open by a trembling hand, and its contents were as follows. Dear Sir, as you know by this time, your son has been kidnapped. You need fear no physical harm for him, provided you live up carefully to the following instructions, and such others as you will receive by future communications. Should you, however, disobey any of our instructions, even slightly, his death will be the penalty. For obvious reasons, make absolutely no attempt to communicate with either the police, authorities, or any private agency. Should you have already communicated with the police, allow them to continue their investigations, but do not mention this letter. Secure before noon today $10,000. This money must be composed entirely of old bills of the following denominations: $2,050 bills, $8,020 bills. The money must be old. Any attempt to include any new or marked bills will render the entire venture futile. The money should be placed in a large cigar box, or if that is impossible, in a heavy cardboard box, securely wrapped and bound in white paper. The wrapping paper should be sealed at all openings with sealing wax. Remain at home until 1 o'clock p.m. See that the telephone is not in use. As a final word of warning, this is a strictly commercial proposition, and we are prepared to put our threat into execution should we have reasonable grounds to believe that you have committed one infraction of the above instructions. However, should you carefully follow the instructions to the letter, we can assure you that your son will be safely returned to you within 6 hours after receipt of the money. Yours truly, George Johnson. Mr. Johnson had scored heavily. If his ends were terrorization, he achieved them over and over again. Not a robust man, Mr. Franks could hardly contain himself. He sank into a chair, trembling as though he were about to be seized with hysteria. Bewildered and overwhelmed, he could only give a wild stare of terror in answer to the repeated pleadings of his friend, who sought to console and sustain him. The cool, deliberate tone of the letter was terrorizing. The character of its composition, too, was baffling. Who, with sufficient intelligence to write such a letter, would abduct and threaten to murder harmless little Robert Franks? Where and how did such a monster exist? Equally frightening was the self-confidence of the kidnapper or kidnappers. He was sure of his ground, apparently, for he was content to let the police continue their investigations. In the event, they had already been employed. There remained in the end but one course, to accede wholly to the wishes of Mr. Johnson. In his hands was the precious fate of little Robert. Like a shield, the very life of the boy stood between the kidnapper and his victims, rendering them as helpless and powerless as the boy who had been kidnapped. It was like shooting into a dark room where one could not distinguish between friend and foe and fight back. Mr. Franks set off for the bank to draw out $10,000. The press, the neglected press, the newspaper men were still waiting for the break, which is to say any break. The city editor was munching today's hard apple. Mr. Ryan at High Park was drawing joy and nectar from a narrow bottle and poking fun at the government. Then, the hell that puts the newspaper world on its toes, transforms some tranquil editorial rooms into madhouses, broke loose in a bust that jarred reporterdom. The story of the hour. The crime of the century. It was just the beginning. Mr. Ryan heard about it, requested his informers to quit kidding, and lay down in a pure whiskey stupor, which he hoped would and did last for 2 days. Now it was time for the police to let loose. Everything was out, and everything would have to be in the open. Chief Morgan A. Collins summoned the detective officials into conference. He told them that this was the opportunity of their lives. Detective Lieutenants William Shoemaker and Michael Grady were put in active charge, with the authority to draw upon such of the powers of the police department as would be in the interest of their investigations. I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that Shoemaker was one of the police detectives involved in the strange case of Harry Church, the man who murdered the car salesman so that he wouldn't have to pay for the car. If you haven't listened to that one, go ahead and listen to it. It's called The Strange Tale of Harry Church. I'm sorry, it's called The Strange Tale of Harvey Church. So anyway, William Shoemaker and Michael Grady were put in active charge with the authority to draw upon such of the powers of the police department as would be in the interest of their investigations. Thus, while Mr. Franks faced with dread a foe he had never seen, Chief Hughes prepared to run him down, cost what it might and necessitate what it would. Simultaneously, a dozen detective squads were assigned to strategic points throughout the city in the scheme of covering up, which is the procedure of tapping all possible sources of information. By an indirect process of elimination, the detective squads boiled the Franks case down to the point where it became fairly obvious that the kidnapping was not the work of organized criminals or gangsters. While the nature of the ransom letter gave rise to this assumption, the work of the detectives added logic to the supposition because they were able to give a reasonable account of the conduct of all the gangs, and especially those that were in the kidnapping business. "The motive for the kidnapping of Robert Franks," declared Chief Hughes in a statement issued to the press after he had heard the reports of his detective squads, "is ransom money. $10,000 is not a lot of money for kidnapping, but the kidnappers appear to be of judicious persons. It's logical that they did not ask for $50,000 for fear that the father would resist or find it inconvenient to raise the sum." Such official admissions as these, issued as they were at various times by detectives, investigators, and criminologists, fanned the fires of sensation in every newspaper reader's breast. It was like some dramatic detective novel. In a brief time, a city of 3 million people had completely forgotten about sales projects, time clocks, and daily traction controversy to play investigator and Sherlock Holmes against real live kidnappers in a quote $1 million unquote atmosphere. Police officials were ready to swear to this truth, for with the passing hours, the developments of the case brought an avalanche of amateur sleuths and freelance investigators down upon the city's head until the town was fairly overrun with mail-order operatives and self-authorized agents of the long arm of the law. Indeed, there was an imminent danger that length and growth would be the arm's undoing, and there was need of restraint upon the activities of these persons. Many of them were squelched in the beginning. Others persisted doggedly and perhaps contributed to the official undertaking. Maybe. Attention was focused upon the ransom missive. Its outward character was that of the conventional letter. It bore a Chicago dateline, and the salutation was the formal "Dear Sir." The stamp of the registry at the post office was 2 p.m. at the Hyde Park station, which meant that the letter had been mailed but a few blocks from its final destination. Here, in the opinion of the detectives, was an example of sheer daring or abysmal ignorance. This was not only the familiar coming back to the scene of the crime, but it was returning before the crime had been fully committed. That deduction only served to further complicate a complex situation. Copies of the fateful letter were given to the press for publication. Suddenly, the secretary to the detective chief and a newspaper man noted the similarity of the letter to another in some way or another. Where had they seen it before? The secretary suddenly remembered a story that had been running serially in a detective magazine. The Kidnapping Syndicate was the title. It was a strikingly gruesome yarn having to do with the kidnapping of a rich man's wife by a gang calling itself the Syndicate. That there was a pronounced, if only intangible, relation between this kidnapping of fiction and the one of fact was strangely evident in the two letters whose contents were too identical for coincidence. The numerous points of resemblance between this and the letter quoted earlier will be readily observed and might well be noted because of its later significance. The fictional ransom note from the fictional story The Kidnapping Syndicate read as follows. Alright, we're going to pause our story right here. Join me back here on Sunday, October 16th, for part 2 of The Chicago Horror, Leopold and Loeb. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery. If you've enjoyed today's Kinda Murdery, please tell your friends and family. Tell strangers, leave a review. It's the best way to ensure that I can keep telling that special brand of bizarre and terrible tales that you'll only find here on Kinda Murdery.